I'm James Rule. Welcome to the Lonely Leader podcast, where we help existing and aspiring leaders find clarity, build resilience, drive performance, and enhance fulfillment. The strength in vulnerability, a leadership essential. That's the topic for today's episode, and I've picked it particularly because I see this as an area that prompts a lot of confusion and uncertainty. Should I show vulnerability? Should I not? Is it a show of weakness or a show of strength? And full disclosure, winding the clock way back to when I stepped into my first CEO role in my late 20s, I had a perspective on this that if you're showing vulnerability, it's a sign of weakness, it's going to unsettle your team, it's not what leaders do. People are looking to you for strength, confidence, and direction. So the very worst thing that you can do is to show vulnerability in that role. You're going to undermine the confidence of your people. You're going to stall the momentum and the direction of travel of the organization. But with experience, during the subsequent years of senior leadership roles and CEO tenures, I realized that that perception was misguided. Now, there is some caveat and some nuance to that I'm going to go into, but it is fundamentally wrong to think that any expression of vulnerability is a weakness. In my experience, what I learned, and with the benefit now of coaching leaders all around the world, when you show vulnerability in the right way, it builds connectivity. It connects you with your people. It allows you to bring authenticity to the table. And that authenticity and connection builds a deeper level of trust. And when you build and wrap that connection, that authenticity, and that trust together, what you actually do is build a very, very powerful culture, an environment where people want to be a part of and that people don't want to leave. Now, authenticity, just a quick nod to that, is another huge leadership essential in its own right. And I'll include a link in the show notes to another episode I've recorded specifically on the power of authenticity. As I frame this episode, I can already feel the cynicism of you reflecting on what I'm saying and saying, yeah, but hang on, vulnerability, that will show weakness. I'm not sure I want to go down this path. So I think it's important to clarify that this is not about oversharing. This is not about emotional dumping, stress dumping all over your team. There's a balance to be struck. And going back to my earlier point, I'm not advocating that you lose your composure, lose your cool, and regularly overshare and burden your staff with each and every stress point, frustration, and source of anxiety that you're currently processing. I think it's got to be far more intentional than that. And so in order to sort of unpack that a little bit, let me give you a couple of examples of where I think vulnerability comes to the fore and can be very impactful. That is, as you'll hear, very different to just a stress dump and something that will probably frighten your staff thinking, well, our leaders lost it. They're running around like the proverbial headless chicken here. What's going on, and should we be concerned? First and foremost, own your mistakes. Become comfortable saying, I got that wrong. I made a mistake. That willingness to be that open and show some humility is a wonderful way to build trust, respect, and connection with your people, because you are only human. You will not go through your entire professional role, your leadership tenure at whatever level you are leading, and never make a mistake. So don't hide from the fact. Be open about it. In my experience, a lot of people struggle with it because they feel, well, that's a sign of weakness. So my counter to that is you can pair your admission of a mistake with your suggested solution. So for instance, you're talking to your senior leaders, you're talking to your staff, and you say, hands up, I got that wrong. I apologize, I made a mistake. Here's what I plan to do about it. Here's my strategy, my solution. So for any of you that think, I just don't want to show any weakness, well, you're immediately showing that, yes, I have made a mistake, but I've still got my composure. I've still got my hand on the proverbial tiller. I am still thinking about solutions and next steps. Now, my next point will undoubtedly sound like I'm contradicting myself, but Be comfortable admitting that you don't have the answer yet. It's another form of vulnerability. We delude ourselves into thinking we have to have all answers to every problem at our fingertips every minute of the day. But there will be periods, events, situations where you're not entirely sure what to do. And it's absolutely fine to show the vulnerability and say, well, I'm not exactly sure what the right choice is here. Maybe you have to then say, let me reflect on it. Equally, what I would always advise is that you ask for input. It's not a dictatorship. You are not losing credibility with your staff if you don't have an answer to every problem. Quite the contrary, by saying, not quite sure the best step here. What do you think? Drawing the team towards you. So we've got different forms of vulnerability here. Being comfortable admitting you've made a mistake, being comfortable recognizing that you don't yet have the answer, and being comfortable asking for your team's suggestion and input in shaping the way forward. Now, I hope when you look at those simple steps, you start to realize, hang on, this isn't how I perceive vulnerability. I'm sure your hesitance and resistance to explore this topic is because you just think it's you just saying, I'm so stressed, I'm so overwhelmed. Now, let me just be clear. There's nothing wrong with saying that you're stressed and overwhelmed, but I think it's selective. We all need a trusted confidant, somebody within the organization, perhaps a mentor or a coach outside of the organization where you can truly open up and say, I'm really struggling. But I think that is selective for selected people. It's not company wide. However, these sort of questions that we've talked about, I made a mistake. Not quite sure the best next step. What would you suggest? What would you do in this situation? Can go to any level of an organization, your senior leadership team, right down to the very most junior levels of the organizational structure. Because wherever you employ them, you will build that connectivity, that trust, and that sense of togetherness, which is a hugely positive and impactful thing on any organizational culture where everybody will benefit as a consequence. I think one of the powerful spin-offs, secondary benefits of this, if you will, is it helps to create and drive that development of psychological safety within your organization. We've talked about that a lot in previous episodes, but fundamentally, you want everybody in the organization to feel comfortable contributing, reviewing what is working well, what's not working well, being able to critique individual or team performance with the end goal of driving higher standards and better performance, but without fear of attack, ridicule, or embarrassment if they have the courage to step forward and say, I don't think this is working well, or I don't think we're doing this to the best of our abilities. When you show some vulnerability as a leader, I'm reiterating the points we've already utilized, but I made a mistake. I'm not exactly sure what to do next. These are all steps to show that it's okay to not always have the answers. It's okay to show a little bit of vulnerability. I think that's another powerful step in creating psychological safety. And I love to read. I love to read around leadership. I love to read around successful leaders in all sorts of sectors. And you get little nuggets, little elements of wisdom. And one thing I remember touching on was Alan Mulally, who stepped into the Ford Motor Company back in the early 2000s. There was a lot of problems, a lot of challenges within the organization. But one of the things he drove was that element of psychological safety. He encouraged, wanted, insisted, if you will, for his senior executives to be able to look for problems, to express that there's a problem, rather than hide from it for fear of criticism or ridicule. He knew that they wouldn't fix things and move forward if they didn't bring all those proverbial skeletons out of the closet, expose them, and start to come up with solutions. So he shifted that climate of fear and removed that fear of critique as a simple step to encourage people to step forward and show a little bit of vulnerability for the greater good of the organization. For those of you that haven't listened to previous episodes or haven't worked with me personally, I spent a huge amount of my career working in elite sport, initially as a professional rugby union player, both in the UK and overseas, but predominantly as a chief executive leading two different sporting clubs. So from that vantage point, I got a up close and personal view of the pressures on elite athletes. You are subject to opinion, criticism on an almost daily basis, and the advent of social media, etc., exacerbates that and takes it to an unprecedented level. So it's very difficult for players to wrestle with this notion of showing vulnerability. But actually, within the review and preview process that takes place in sport every week, it happens automatically. The coaches are encouraging them to show that vulnerability and say, I made a mistake. This didn't work well. They've even got the footage that they can play and work back and say, this is what I should have done, or I made a mistake. I'm not sure what I should have done there. And then asking the coaches or their fellow players, what do you suggest? So, this notion of show some vulnerability, why? So that you can learn and improve, is very much hardwired into the elite athlete's DNA. And one very high profile situation that comes to mind, Simone Biles, the US gymnast back in the Olympics in Tokyo in 2021, she stood down from some of the events. Now, she was criticized by huge sectors of society for doing that. And I can understand some elements of perspective there that, well, hang on, this is your moment, what are you doing? But equally, I've seen the extreme pressures that can be put on elite athletes when they're in that goldfish bowl. And so I think actually it took immense courage to show a little bit of vulnerability there. Well, not a little bit, significant, and say, I'm really struggling here. So I'm going to step back, regroup, and come back to the table, as it were, and continue to compete. I think that actually should be looked at as a positive rather than a negative. Another senior leader that comes to mind, Michelle Obama. She's talked in her book and various speeches about the challenges she's wrestled with, imposter syndrome, which knocks on the door of most of us at some point, wrestling with the counter demands of being a mum and a first lady. So she's a great example of somebody who has not been frightened to show some vulnerability, which builds connectivity and trust and draws people towards her as a consequence. So I always like to pull out some examples. Some will resonate more than others, but the guiding principle is you are not alone if you have the courage to show some vulnerability within the framework that we're talking about. So as ever, when you listen to the podcast, I like to sort of punch things down into some concise takeaways. This episode is no different. So we've already given some pertinent points that you can lift and extract and start to weave into your leadership DNA. But here's some additional points that I would love for you to reflect and consider. So the first tip is be comfortable saying, I made a mistake. You are only human. As we said earlier, leaders are making an unprecedented number of decisions on a daily basis. So it is deluded to think you're never going to make a mistake. Have the willingness and the desire to be able to say, I made a mistake. Tip number 2, normalize feedback. Make it a part of the DNA of the organization. It's not always comfortable to hear, but you want a team and a culture where people can give and take feedback, where people feel comfortable, going back to tip number 1, saying, I made a mistake. And allow and have the humility to let people tell you they think you've made a mistake or that you've drifted off course. It needs to be normalized. And when it's done right, it allows that creation of psychological safety, which is so important in a high-performing team and culture. Tip number 3, share failures as lessons. This is something sport does so well. Each and every match or event or individual performance is analysed, dissected. Often there is real-time footage that can be played back and everybody can see what went well and what didn't go well. Now, individual analysis like that in front of people's peers is not a tool to shame them, embarrass them, humiliate them. It's a learning experience. And that is so important to embrace. Hey, this didn't work. We're dissecting it so that we can all learn from it. That's the reason why we feel comfortable talking about it individually as a leader or as a group. We can't shy away from failure. We must step into it and say, this didn't work. Why didn't it work? What are the learnings? Disseminate them across the team, and let's minimize the likelihood of those errors taking place again. So you see that as a very positive outcome of being able to show the vulnerability and dissect and address and talk about failure. Tip number 4, Don't overshare and offload. As we've talked about throughout this episode, the vulnerability we're talking about here is intentional. It's designed to build connection, allow you to bring your authenticity to the table and build trust, develop solutions, and move the individual and the collective forward. That's very intentional. There's a big difference between that and just an emotional dump, pouring all of your stress onto somebody else. That does sometimes need to happen, but as we explored earlier, I would encourage you to do that in a much more selected and targeted environment with a trusted confidant or mentor, because that dumping of emotion doesn't help anybody. It doesn't help drive solutions. All it does is it just knocks other people off course. Your emotions and energy bleeds into them. It undermines their ability to perform. So be selective about where you share those emotional insights and don't just dump them unwittingly onto a colleague. The next tip is acknowledge team emotions. And this has a dotted line back to normalizing feedback. You will have a sense on the emotional thermostat of your team. Sometimes you can feel the simmering tensions, and there's a whole range of reasons behind that. But you don't want to ignore that. You need to step into that. Sometimes an individual might be frustrated with the performance of another individual. Sometimes somebody's carrying a burden, they just need to ask for advice, they're struggling, but they're not sure how to step forward and bring that to the fore. So as a leader, you've got to be cognizant of these situations. You've got to encourage that psychological safety. You've got to normalize the feedback. Lots of these points bleed into each other. But when there's tension, it's your job to diffuse it. Might be one-to-one, it might be within a group. Wherever it originates, it will compromise the performance of individuals, the team, and ultimately the business if you don't step forward. And one of the great ways to expose and reduce it is the quality communication, underpinned by people being comfortable showing the vulnerability when they need to, with a high degree of psychological safety, and everybody bringing their authentic self to the table. I want you to be comfortable stating, I don't know. It's a little bit like our first point, being comfortable saying, I've made a mistake. You cannot have all of the answers. I don't know can often be followed by yet. You give people confidence that you will find the answer, but you don't yet have it immediately at your fingertips. And equally, there's another dotted line into, I don't know, what do you think? Being comfortable asking for feedback. It's another form of vulnerability that I think is leadership 101. What planet, what school of thought says we have to have every single answer to every single solution just because we're the leader? It's a complete delusion, and yet I see a lot of leaders wrestling with it. It's fine to say, I don't know. It's fine to draw feedback and answers from your team. That's why you build a high-performing team, because you've got highly capable, intelligent, experienced people all around you. So lean on that. Draw from it. Let it complement your ideas and your thoughts. But nobody says you have to be a dictatorial leader that has all the answers. Because, truth be told, if that is the strategy you adopt, you're going to lose people. People are not going to want to follow you and be a part of the journey if they don't feel they have a voice or are valued sufficiently to contribute to strategy. So be comfortable saying, I don't know, and be comfortable asking people, what do you think? Focus on connection. If you want people to feel comfortable being vulnerable, if you want people to be comfortable truly contributing, if you want people to feel that they can give feedback, that they can course correct individual performance or team performance, all of that starts with connection. And all of that connection starts with how you operate as the leader. You want a culture where people actively listen, give each other that respect that they deserve, can give and take feedback without taking it personally and attacking or becoming defensive, allowing your ego to step into play. And you need to role model those behaviors. How do you connect with your people? How do you make them feel valued? It starts with you. People take the lead from you, and they will cascade that out into their connections and relationships with their teams across the wider organization. And my final point, be consistent. If you think of vulnerability as a one-time thing, you're going to drift into that. It's just a dumping of emotion or an exposure to your emotional state that actually disrupts far more than it enhances team or individual performance. What we're talking about here is being intentional, but being consistent. You don't just put your hand up once every 4 or 5 occasions that you make a mistake and said, I made a mistake. You have the humility to do it every time. You have the humility to constantly be asking your team, I've got a problem. I've not got the perfect solution. What would you do? You are consistently looking at ways to connect with people to build that trust. So just challenging yourself to be consistent. That's why I consider this a leadership essential. Leadership essentials are traits that we need to be demonstrating repeatedly. And there's a whole raft of them within the back catalogue of the Lonely Leader. I'll put a couple of others in. I've already mentioned authenticity. I'll put another couple of leadership essential episodes within the show notes. As ever, I hope these reflections have been helpful. Vulnerability is not weakness. It's actually a form of strength. It can be an X factor. It can be a superpower. It can galvanize people. It shows that you are a real human being, and that can only help build the connection and the trust that every leader needs to feel reciprocated with their people if they're going to build a high-performing team and do special things within their organization. So don't fear it, embrace it. I had a misguided perception of it early in my leadership tenure. I hope these reflections encourage you to ensure that you don't embrace that misguided perception and you find the time and the place and the strategy to bring vulnerability to the fore when needed to enhance the performance of you as a leader and your wider organization. I wish you the very best of luck with the implementation of it. Thanks for listening to the Lonely Leader podcast. I'd be very grateful if you could share and follow if the content resonates. And if you're looking for additional free resource to support your continued growth and development, then please do check out our social media and website details in the show notes. Remember, quality leadership on the outside must always start within.